Her mother-in-law pushed her into a dry well to eliminate her. But at the bottom, she found her billionaire husband's ancestors' gold chest and a will saying, "Whoever finds it becomes the legal heir." Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories, your own family story channel. Heavenly God, today I lift every woman in this family into your loving hands. Bless her with strength that never breaks, patience that never dries, and dignity that no storm can shake. Honor her silent sacrifices, her sleepless nights, her tears she never shows, and the love she gives without limits. May her body be guarded with health, her mind filled with calm, and her heart wrapped in peace. Wherever she walks, let respect walk beside her. Wherever she speaks, let wisdom follow her voice. Let no woman here ever feel unseen, unheard, or unvalued, because in your eyes she is precious beyond measure. My beautiful family, women are the backbone of our homes, the steady light in our darkest hours, the reason love survives. Protect them, respect them, pray for them, and never forget their worth. If you are here with a true heart, stay with this story till the end, because everything I write is for you, with love and honor. If your heart is true, write present. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. Let's start with love. The last thing Marseille Peak saw before the darkness swallowed her was her mother-in-law's smile. Not the polite smile Diane Connolly wore for photographers at charity galas. Not the tight-lipped smile she used when introducing Marseille as Glenn's wife, with just enough pause before the word to make it sound temporary. This was different. This smile held satisfaction, relief, and something that looked almost like love. The kind of love a mother has when she believes she's protecting her child from danger. Marseille had exactly enough time to understand what was happening before the rope ladder went slack beneath her feet and she fell into the earth. The morning had started the way every morning started in the Connolly mansion, with Glenn already gone. Marseille woke to cold sheets and the distant sound of her husband's voice drifting up from his study, already on a conference call before sunrise. She lay there, listening to him negotiate, his voice firm and confident in ways it never was when he spoke to her anymore. When had that changed? When had she become background noise in her own marriage? She knew the answer. The day Glenn's father died and the empire fell onto his husband's shoulders like a building collapse. Marseille pushed herself out of bed and stood at the window overlooking the estate grounds. The old well sat at the edge of the property, a stone circle surrounded by overgrown weeds that nobody had bothered with in generations. The Connolly family had more important things to maintain than abandoned wells, like appearances and legacies, and the crushing weight of expectations that had turned her husband into a stranger. She still remembered the Glenn who had pursued her with such intensity that her friends told her to run. He'd shown up at her job with flowers, written her letters that quoted poetry he'd actually read himself, stayed up until dawn, talking about everything and nothing. That Glenn had looked at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered. Now Glenn looked at quarterly reports. "Good morning, daughter." Marseille turned to find Diane standing in the doorway of the bedroom. Her mother-in-law never knocked anymore. Sometime during the past 3 years, Diane had decided that boundaries didn't apply to her, that every room in this house belonged to her by divine right of having birthed the heir. "Good morning, Diane. Is Glenn still working?" Diane stepped into the room, already dressed impeccably despite the early hour. Everything about Diane was impeccable. Her silver hair styled perfectly, her jewelry tasteful and expensive, her posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. "He has calls this morning." "He always has calls." Diane moved to the dresser, touching things that weren't hers, Marseille's perfume bottles, her jewelry box, the framed photo of Marseille's late mother. "My son works too hard. He's been working himself to death ever since his father passed. I worry about him constantly." Marseille said nothing, This was Diane's favorite game, expressing concern for Glenn while making it clear that Marseille wasn't doing enough to help him. Never mind that Marseille had begged Glenn to take a vacation, to see a therapist, to let her carry some of the burden. He'd brushed her off every time, disappearing deeper into work while his mother took over more and more of the household decisions. "I need to speak with you about something," Diane said, her voice taking on that particular tone that always preceded bad news. "Privately. Glenn will be done with his call soon." "This can't wait." Diane's smile appeared, the one that looked warm but never reached her eyes. "It's about Glenn's birthday next week. I want to do something special for him, something meaningful. You know the old well on the property?" Marseille blinked at the sudden change in subject. "The abandoned one?" "It's not abandoned, dear. It's historical. Glenn's great-great-grandfather built it when this estate was first established. When Glenn was a boy, he used to play near it all the time. He even dropped some of his childhood drawings down there, silly little sketches he'd made of the house and the grounds. I found his old journal recently, and he'd written about how much those drawings meant to him." Diane moved closer, and Marseille caught the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with something else. Desperation, maybe, or determination. "I thought we could retrieve them for his birthday. Give him something from his childhood. Remind him of simpler times. He needs that right now, don't you think? With all the stress he's under?" It was the first time Diane had ever suggested doing something thoughtful for Glenn that involved including Marseille. That should have been the warning sign. That should have made Marseille suspicious. But she was so starved for any sign of acceptance from this woman, so desperate to find common ground, that she ignored the cold feeling in her stomach. "That's a lovely idea," Marseille said carefully. "We could hire someone to—" No, it should be us, his wife and his mother, working together for him." Diane's smile widened. "Besides, the well isn't deep. There's an old rope ladder still attached. I checked it myself yesterday. Perfectly safe." That was how Marseille found herself walking across the estate grounds an hour later, following Diane through the morning mist toward the well. Glenn was still in his study, still on calls, still drowning in the business that consumed him. Marseille had knocked on his door before leaving, but he'd waved her away without even asking where she was going. The well sat in a forgotten corner of the property, hidden behind a cluster of old oak trees. Someone had covered it with wooden boards decades ago, but Diane had already removed them, revealing the dark stone opening and the rope ladder that disappeared into shadows. "You're sure this is safe?" Marseille asked, peering down into the darkness. "Completely safe. I tested the ladder myself. The drawings are right at the bottom. I could see them with my flashlight. Just climb down, grab them and climb back up. It'll take 5 minutes." Diane handed her a small flashlight. "I'd go myself, but my knees aren't what they used to be." Marseille should have said no, should have insisted they get professional help, should have listened to the voice in her head that was screaming danger. But Diane was watching her with those calculating eyes, and Marseille was so tired of being the outsider, the one who didn't belong, the one who couldn't do anything right. "Okay," she said. 5 minutes. The rope ladder felt solid under her hands. Marseille tested it carefully, then began climbing down into the well. The stone walls were damp and cold, covered in moss that had grown in the darkness for generations. The flashlight cast strange shadows as she descended, and she could smell earth and stagnant water and something old that had been buried and forgotten. She was halfway down when she heard the sound above her, something scraping, wood sliding over stone. Marseille looked up just in time to see Diane's face appear over the edge of the well, backlit by morning sun. "I'm sorry," Diane said, and she actually sounded sorry. "But you were never going to be good enough for my son. You were never going to be family. Some things are just in the blood, and you—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You were always temporary." "Diane, what are you—" The rope ladder went slack. Marseille's stomach dropped as she realized what was happening. Her hands tightened on the ropes, but they were already falling, already loose, already cut. She screamed Glenn's name, but the sound died in the well's throat, swallowed by stone and earth and the terrible distance between where she was and where anyone might hear her. She fell. But instead of the bone-shattering impact she expected, Marseille landed on something soft. The bottom of the well was piled with old debris, rotted canvas tarps, decomposed hay bales, layers of organic material that had accumulated over decades. The cushioning saved her life, absorbing the impact enough that she felt bruised and shaken, but not broken. She lay there gasping, the wind knocked out of her lungs, staring up at the circle of sky that was rapidly disappearing as Diane dragged the wooden boards back over the opening. "Nothing personal, dear," Diane's voice drifted down, muffled now by wood and distance. "I lost one son already. I won't lose another to someone who doesn't understand what this family needs, what Glenn needs. You would have left him eventually anyway. Women like you always do. I'm just speeding up the inevitable." The last board slid into place, and the world went dark. Marseille lay in the blackness at the bottom of the well, shaking and terrified, and listened to her mother-in-law's footsteps fade away across the grass. Above her, in the mansion, her husband was still on his conference call, still making deals, still completely unaware that his wife was trapped in the ground beneath his feet. She tried to scream again, but her voice came out weak and desperate. She tried to stand, and found she could. Nothing was broken, though everything hurt from the impact. She tried to stay calm, but panic was pulling her down, deeper than the well, deeper than the earth, into a place where nothing existed except the memory of Diane's smile and the terrible understanding that nobody was coming to save her. The last thing Marseille thought before the tears came was, "Glenn, I called your name." Then she began to cry in the dark, and the well swallowed her screams whole. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Marseille cried until her voice was raw and her throat burned. She screamed Glenn's name until the sound became a whisper. She pounded on the stone walls until her hands were bruised. She shone the flashlight up at the wooden boards covering the well, hoping to find a gap, a weakness, any way to signal for help. Nothing. The boards were solid, the well was deep, and her voice couldn't carry through stone and wood and the distance to the mansion where her husband continued his business day without her. Above, she could hear muffled sounds, voices, laughter, the distant clink of glasses. The party. Diane was hosting her charity luncheon today, the one she'd been planning for weeks. The one where she would stand in front of wealthy donors and talk about family values and community support, while her daughter-in-law was trapped in a well 50 feet from the house. Marseille sank down onto the cushioning debris that had saved her life and tried to think. She wasn't badly injured, bruised, shaken, terrified, but physically intact. The fall should have killed her, but the layers of old tarps and decomposed materials at the bottom had absorbed the impact. She was alive. That was something. But for how long? The well was too deep to climb without equipment. The walls were smooth stone, slick with moisture, impossible to scale. Even if she screamed herself hoarse, nobody would hear her through the boards and the distance. Glenn thought she was visiting her mother. The staff thought she'd gone into town. Nobody would look for her because nobody knew she was missing. Diane had planned this perfectly. Marseille felt rage begin to replace the fear. This woman had pushed her into a well to die, had smiled while doing it, and was now entertaining guests while waiting for her daughter-in-law to suffocate or starve in the darkness. She refused to give Diane that satisfaction. Marseille forced herself to stand, to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. She shone the flashlight around the well's bottom, looking for anything that might help her survive, anything that might give her an advantage. That was when the light caught something that didn't belong. There, embedded in the well's wall about chest height, was a rectangular shape that looked different from the surrounding stone. Marseille moved closer and brushed away decades of dirt and moss. It was a door. or what had once been a door. A small wooden hatch built into the stone wall, so old and weathered that it blended perfectly with its surroundings. The wood was swollen with moisture and age, but when Marseille pulled on the rusted handle, something inside gave way with a crack that echoed through the well. The door fell open, revealing a hollow space carved into the wall, and inside that space was a chest. Marseille pulled it out carefully, her hands shaking. It was heavy, made of dark wood bound with iron, covered in the same moss and dirt as everything else down here. There was a lock, but it had rusted through completely. When she lifted the lid, the hinges screamed in protest. Gold! The flashlight beam reflected off piles of gold coins, jewelry, ornate pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. Marseille's breath caught in her throat as she reached in, touching metal that was still smooth and perfect despite the decades buried in darkness. There was more underneath the gold, documents wrapped in oiled leather, preserved against the moisture. Marseille pulled them out with trembling fingers and unfolded the first one. It was a will. The handwriting was old-fashioned, written in careful script that spoke of a different era. But the words were clear enough, and as Marseille read them by flashlight, she felt the fear in her chest transform into something sharper, something more dangerous. I, Edmund Connolly, being of sound mind and broken heart, do hereby decree that the Connolly fortune shall not pass to my sons, who have proven themselves unworthy through greed and violence. Instead, let this wealth go to whomever discovers this chest, for they shall have endured what my sons would not: the darkness, the fall, the very real possibility of death. If you are reading this, you have survived. You have earned what my blood could not. By the power vested in me as patriarch and sole owner of the Connolly estate, I declare the finder of this chest to be the true and legal heir to all Connolly holdings, lands, and assets. My son's inheritance is hereby revoked. Let the worthy inherit what the wicked would destroy. The document was dated over a century ago. It was notarized, signed by witnesses, bearing the official seals that made it legal and binding. Marseille read it twice, then 3 times, making sure she understood what she was holding. Edmund Connolly had hidden his fortune in the same well where his daughter-in-law would nearly die. He had written this will after watching his sons poison each other over money, after realizing that blood meant nothing when corruption ran deeper than family ties. And now Marseille held the proof that she owned everything. Not just some of the Connolly fortune, everything. The estate, the companies, the family name itself. Edmund's will superseded all others, and according to the legal language carefully spelled out in the document, it was irrevocable. The finder was the heir. The survivor inherited it all. Marseille started laughing. The sound bounced off the well walls and came back to her multiplied, echoing up toward the party where Diane was probably telling everyone how devoted she was to family, how much she'd sacrificed for her children, how blessed she was to have such a loving son. The laughter turned to tears, and the tears turned back to rage, and Marseille clutched the will against her chest and made a promise to herself. She would survive this. She would get out of this well. She would take everything from the woman who had tried to bury her. But first, she had to escape. Marseille looked up at the wooden boards covering the well's opening. They were too high to reach, even standing on the chest. She examined the walls again, looking for any weakness, any handhold that might help her climb. The stone was too smooth, too slick with moss. Even with the debris pile giving her some height, she couldn't reach high enough to matter. She was trapped, alive, uninjured, holding a fortune in gold and a will that made her the wealthiest woman in the state, but trapped in a tomb with no way out. The irony wasn't lost on her. Hours passed. The party sounds faded. Afternoon light began to dim, filtered weakly through cracks in the boards above. Marseille tried everything she could think of: piling debris higher, using pieces of the old canvas to create makeshift ropes, searching for any tool or implement that might help her escape. Nothing worked. She was stuck. As darkness fell completely, Marseille sat with her back against the cold stone wall and faced the truth. She might die down here after all. Not from the fall, but from exposure, from dehydration, from the slow realization that nobody was coming to save her. Glenn hadn't even noticed she was gone. He'd waved her away this morning without asking where she was going, and he probably hadn't thought about her since. He was too busy with his calls, his contracts, his empire that consumed every moment of his attention. Marseille closed her eyes and let the tears come again. Not tears of fear anymore, but tears of grief for the marriage she'd tried so hard to save, for the man she'd loved who had slowly disappeared into work and obligations until there was nothing left of the person who had once made her laugh. She cried for herself too, for the woman who had spent 3 years trying to be good enough, trying to earn her place, trying to matter to people who had already decided she was temporary. She cried until there were no tears left, and then she sat in the darkness, holding the will that proved her worth, and waited to see if anyone would remember she existed. Hours crawled by, night deepened, the cold seeped into her bones, and then, faintly, she heard something. Footsteps. Not above at the mansion, but nearby. Someone walking past the well, close enough that she could hear leaves crunching under their feet. Marseille scrambled to her feet and screamed, "Help! Help me! I'm trapped in the well!" The footsteps stopped. "Please!" Marseille's voice cracked with desperation. "Please, someone help me! I'm down here!" She heard the footsteps approach the well, heard someone pulling at the boards covering the opening. "Hello?" A man's voice, rough and uncertain. "Someone down there?" Yes, please help me. My mother-in-law pushed me in and covered the well. Please get me out." More sounds of boards being moved, and then suddenly there was a gap in the covering, and Marseille could see stars. A face appeared over the edge, an older man with weathered features and kind eyes. "Sweet Jesus," he said, "how long you been down there?" "Since this morning. Please, can you help me out?" "Hold on, let me get these boards off." The man worked quickly, clearing the opening and revealing the night sky. "I was cutting through the property on my way home from work. Heard you crying. This is the Connolly estate, isn't it?" "Yes. I'm Marseille Connolly, Glenn's wife." The man's expression darkened. "They know you're down here?" "My mother-in-law does. She's the one who pushed me." Christ almighty. He looked around, then found a length of rope in his truck parked nearby. "I'm going to lower this down. Can you tie it around yourself?" "Yes, but there's a chest down here too. Can you help me get it out?" "A chest? What kind of chest?" "It's important, please." The man looked skeptical, but nodded. "All right, you first, then the chest." He lowered the rope and Marseille tied it around herself with shaking hands. The man was strong despite his age, pulling her up slowly and steadily until she could grab the edge of the well and haul herself out onto solid ground. Marseille collapsed on the grass, gasping and crying, and feeling the night air on her face like a blessing. The man gave her a moment, then lowered the rope again. "Hook it to the chest," he called down. Marseille did, and together they hauled the heavy chest up and out of the well. When it was safely on the ground, the man stared at it with wide eyes. "What you got in there that's so important?" "My future," Marseille said. She pulled out several gold coins and pressed them into his hand. "Please, you saved my life. Take these and don't tell anyone you saw me. Not the police, not the Connollys, nobody." The man looked at the gold, then at Marseille's bruised face and desperate eyes. "Your family did this to you?" "My mother-in-law tried to kill me. If she knows I survived, she'll try again." He closed his fist around the coins. "I never saw nothing. You take care of yourself, Mum, and you make them pay for what they done." "I will," Marseille promised. The man helped her drag the chest to his truck and drove her to the highway, asking no questions. He dropped her at a gas station and drove away into the night, taking her secret with him. Marseille stood in the fluorescent light of the station, filthy and bruised and holding a chest full of gold, and called a taxi to take her to the nearest motel. She had survived, and now she was going to make sure everyone who had failed her would pay the price. Chapter 3. The Resurrection. Marseille spent the first week in a roadside motel, paying cash from a single gold coin she'd sold at a pawn shop. The proprietor had looked at her with suspicion, a woman covered in bruises and dirt, selling antique gold at dawn. But he'd taken the coin and given her enough cash to survive for a while. She told no one where she was. She called no one. She simply existed in that small motel room, sleeping fitfully as her body recovered from the shock of what had happened, waking to stare at the ceiling and plan her next moves. The second week, she began to rebuild. Marseille sat on the motel bed with the will spread out before her, reading it over and over until she'd memorized every word. The legal language was archaic, but clear. Whoever found the chest inherited everything. Not some percentage, not a share of the wealth. Everything. Edmund Connolly had hidden his fortune specifically to keep it away from his sons, who had spent their lives fighting over money they believed was theirs by birthright. He'd watched them poison each other's marriages, sabotage each other's businesses, destroy each other's lives, all for wealth they would never fully possess. So he'd hidden it, buried it in a well where only someone who had fallen could find it. And he'd written a will that ensured the Connolly fortune would go to someone who had earned it through suffering rather than blood. Marseille was that someone. The chest itself was worth a fortune. The gold coins alone could fund her survival for years. But the will was worth something far more valuable. It was revenge wrapped in legal legitimacy. When she presented this document in court, the entire Connolly empire would transfer to her ownership. Glenn would lose everything, his companies, his properties, his family legacy, all of it would become hers by law. And Diane would watch her son's inheritance disappear because she'd pushed the wrong woman into a well. The irony was almost poetic. But Marseille knew she couldn't just walk into a courtroom looking like a trauma victim and expect to be taken seriously. She needed preparation. She needed strategy. She needed to transform herself from the woman who had fallen into the woman who would rise. The third week, she found a lawyer. Ruth Livingston had a small practice in a town far enough from the Connolly estate that the name wouldn't immediately ring bells. Marseille had chosen her carefully, researching attorneys who specialized in estate law and had reputations for being ruthless when necessary. Ruth was a woman in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. When Marseille walked into her office carrying the chest, Ruth's expression didn't change. She'd seen stranger things in her career. "I need to validate a will," Marseille said, placing the chest on Ruth's desk. "And then I need to take everything from the family who tried to kill me." Ruth opened the chest, examined the gold, then picked up the will and began to read. Her eyes widened slightly, the only sign of emotion she showed, and when she finished, she looked at Marseille with something that might have been respect. "This is legitimate," Ruth said. "The legal language is old, but it's solid. Edmund Connolly had the authority to write this will, and the provisions are clear. If you can prove you found this chest, everything he owned transfers to you." "I can prove it." "Then you're about to become one of the wealthiest women in the state." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "But I'm guessing you didn't come here just for legal validation. You came here because you want to make them suffer." "Yes." "Good." Ruth's smile was sharp. "I've spent my career watching families tear each other apart over money. Usually it's the children who destroy each other, but in this case it sounds like the mother is the problem." Marseille told her everything. The well, the fall, the man who had saved her, Glenn's complete absence from any attempt to find her. She watched Ruth's expression harden with each detail, saw the lawyer's own anger rising to match hers. "I lost my own inheritance once," Ruth said when Marseille finished. "My brothers convinced our dying father that I was incompetent, that I needed supervision, that I couldn't be trusted with money. By the time I fought back, most of the estate was gone. So yes, I'll help you. But I'm going to do it right. We're going to build a case so airtight that the Connolly family won't be able to breathe, let alone fight back. How long will it take? Months, maybe longer. We need to authenticate the will, research the estate laws, prepare for every possible challenge they'll throw at us. We also need to file a police report. Attempted murder needs to be documented, and the forensics evidence will support your claim." Ruth pulled out a pad of paper. "And in the meantime, you need to heal. You need to get stronger. You need to transform yourself into someone they won't recognize when you walk back into their lives. I don't want to hide from them. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to become powerful." Ruth began writing. "You're going to take this money from the gold, and you're going to invest in yourself. New clothes, a good doctor, a therapist if you need one. You're going to eat well and sleep well and let your body recover from what they did to you. And then, when you're strong enough, we're going to walk into court and take everything they have. What if Glenn reports me missing? What if Diane tells people I disappeared? Has your husband filed a missing person report?" Marseille thought about the motel room, the weeks of silence, the complete absence of anyone looking for her. "No." "Then he either thinks you left voluntarily or his mother convinced him that you did. Either way, you're not missing. You're gone. And when you come back, you'll come back as the legal owner of everything they thought was theirs." Ruth stood and extended her hand. "I'm going to need a retainer. One of those gold coins should cover it." Marseille shook the lawyer's hand, feeling something shift inside her. This was real. This was happening. She was actually going to do this. "One more thing," Ruth said. "We need to file that police report today. Time is critical for preserving evidence. The well, the boards Diane moved, the cut rope, all of it needs to be documented before she can destroy the proof." That afternoon, Marseille sat in a police station and gave her statement. She showed her bruises, described what happened, and watched as investigators were dispatched to the Connolly estate. They would find Diane's fingerprints on the boards. They would find the cut rope ladder. They would document everything while Diane was still convinced her crime had succeeded. The fourth week, Marseille began her transformation. She followed Ruth's advice, spending gold carefully but purposefully. A doctor examined her and confirmed what she already knew. She'd been lucky. The cushioning at the well's bottom had prevented serious injury. A therapist listened to her story without judgment and helped her process the rage that threatened to consume her. She bought new clothes, not the elegant dresses Diane had approved of, but powerful suits that made her feel like she could walk into any room and command respect. She cut her hair short, dyed it a different color, changed everything about her appearance that reminded her of the woman who had tried to please the Connolly family. That woman was dead. She'd died in the well. The woman who had emerged was someone new, someone harder, sharper, more dangerous, someone who had learned that mercy was for people who hadn't tried to murder you. Marseille stood in front of the motel mirror, barely recognizing her own reflection. She looked powerful now. She looked like someone who owned the world. Soon, that wouldn't be a metaphor. She picked up her phone, the new one she'd bought with cash, and pulled up Glenn's number. She'd had it memorized for years, had called it 1,000 times during their marriage, usually to ask when he'd be home or if he wanted her to save dinner. Her finger hovered over the call button. It would be so easy to dial, to hear his voice, to tell him she was alive. But Marseille put the phone down without calling. Glenn didn't deserve to hear her voice. He'd had weeks to wonder where she was, weeks to file a report, weeks to demand answers from his mother about what had happened to his wife. He'd done nothing, which meant he'd chosen his mother's lie over his wife's absence. Marseille would let him live with that choice, let him think she'd abandoned him, let him wonder if she'd ever loved him at all. And then, when the time was right, she would appear in his life again, not as his wife, but as the owner of everything he'd ever valued. She packed the chest carefully, locked it in the motel safe, and went to bed early. Tomorrow, she and Ruth would continue building the legal case that would destroy the Connolly family. Tomorrow, she would start the war that would end with her standing on top of their empire while they begged for mercy at her feet. Marseille closed her eyes and dreamed of gold and revenge, and the look on Diane's face when she realized that the woman she'd tried to bury had become the most powerful person in the room. Chapter 4. The Ghost. Marseille's first appearance was at Diane's charity luncheon, exactly 1 month after the well. She stood at the back of the hotel ballroom, wearing designer sunglasses and a black dress that cost more than Glenn's monthly salary. Her hair was shorter now, styled differently, and she'd transformed herself into someone who looked like power personified. She looked like a stranger wearing Marseille peak skin. Nobody noticed her at first. Why would they? They were too busy listening to Diane stand at the podium and talk about family values, about supporting your community, about the importance of protecting the people you love. The speech was beautiful, moving, exactly the kind of performance that made Diane Connolly a beloved figure in their social circle. Marseille watched her mother-in-law's face and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Every word out of Diane's mouth was a lie wrapped in silk, and soon everyone in this room would know it. But not yet. Ruth had warned her against moving too fast, against revealing herself before they had every legal weapon in place. So Marseille simply stood there, a ghost at the edge of the party, and let Diane enjoy her final moments of peace. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Diane faltered mid-sentence, her carefully practiced speech stumbling as she stared at the woman in black. Recognition flickered across her face, uncertainty, fear, then dismissal. It couldn't be Marseille. Marseille was dead, buried in a well, gone forever. Diane recovered smoothly, finishing her speech to thunderous applause. But Marseille saw the way her mother-in-law's hands shook as she left the podium, the way she immediately scanned the room looking for the woman in black who had disappeared into the crowd. Marseille was already gone, slipping out the side entrance before anyone could approach her. She sat in her rental car, paid for with gold, untraceable to her real identity, and watched through the tinted windows as Diane emerged from the hotel, looking frantically around the parking lot. The fear on that woman's face was delicious. Marseille started the engine and drove away, leaving Diane standing in the sun, wondering if she'd seen a ghost or if guilt was finally catching up with her. The second appearance was at Glenn's business dinner. Marseille had learned through careful research that Glenn met with potential investors every Thursday at an upscale restaurant downtown. She booked a table across the room, positioned so that she could see him clearly, but blend into the background enough that he might not notice her immediately. She needn't have worried. Glenn was so focused on his pitch, so desperate to secure funding for whatever venture he was chasing, that he barely looked up from his tablet. He'd always been handsome, that hadn't changed, but now he looked haunted. There were shadows under his eyes, a gauntness to his face that spoke of too much stress and not enough sleep. Good. Let him suffer under the weight of responsibilities he'd never wanted. Let him drown in the empire his father had forced on him. Let him feel a fraction of the helplessness Marseille had felt at the bottom of that well. She ordered expensive wine and a meal she didn't eat, watching him through the crowd. At one point, Glenn looked up from his tablet and his gaze swept the restaurant. His eyes passed over her table, moved on, then snapped back. Marseille saw the exact moment recognition hit. Glenn's face went white, his mouth falling open in shock. He half stood from his chair, knocking over his water glass in his haste. She was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd of diners before he could follow. Behind her, she heard his voice calling her name. Marseille? Marseille? But she didn't turn around. She walked out the front entrance, got into her rental car, and drove away while Glenn stood on the sidewalk, staring at the space where she'd been. The third appearance was at the cemetery. Glenn visited his father's grave every week, usually on Sunday mornings, when the cemetery was quiet. Marseille had learned his routine through patient surveillance, watching from a distance as he kept this one ritual that spoke to something deeper than business or obligation. She waited until he was kneeling at the gravestone, then walked past close enough that he couldn't miss her. She wore a dark coat, her face partially hidden, but unmistakably herself. Marseille, Glenn scrambled to his feet. Marseille, wait! She kept walking, her pace steady, but not rushed. Behind her, she could hear him running, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Marseille, please, I need to talk to you. I've been trying to find you for weeks. That stopped her. Marseille turned slowly, pulling down her sunglasses just enough that he could see her eyes. Have you? Glenn looked like he'd been hit. Up close, the damage was more apparent. The weight loss, the exhaustion, the desperation that clung to him like cologne. Where have you been? I thought, your phone is disconnected. Your mother hasn't heard from you. Nobody knows where you are. I've been dead, Glenn. Your mother made sure of it. The confusion on his face was genuine. Whatever lies Diane had told him, he believed them completely. What are you talking about? Mom said you called her, said you needed space, said you were visiting family. Your mother, Marseille interrupted, her voice cold enough to frost glass, pushed me into the old well on the property and left me there to die. Glenn's face went through several expressions at once. Shock, denial, anger, confusion. That's insane. Mom would never... She told me you used to draw pictures as a child and threw them down the well. She said we should retrieve them for your birthday. She had me climb down on a rope ladder, then cut it while I was halfway down and covered the well with boards. Marseille watched his face carefully, looking for any sign that he'd known, that he'd been complicit. But all she saw was genuine horror. I spent 20 hours at the bottom of that well, Glenn. 20 hours crying for help while you sat in your study and ignored me like you've been ignoring me for 3 years. No. Glenn shook his head violently. No, that's not. Mom said you left. She showed me a text from your phone saying you needed time away from me, that our marriage was suffocating you. I never sent that text. But I saw it. I have it on my phone. You said, your mother sent it. She had my phone after she pushed me. She sent you a lie, and you believed her instead of looking for me. Glenn staggered backward like she'd physically struck him. I did look for you. I called your mother's house. I called your friends. Did you call the police? Did you file a missing person report? Did you demand to speak to me directly instead of just accepting a text message? Marseille stepped closer, her voice dropping to something deadly quiet. Or did you just go back to work and let your mother handle everything like you always do? The silence that followed was answer enough. I called you once, Marseille continued, from a gas station after a stranger pulled me out of that well. Do you remember what you did? You declined the call. You were in a meeting. Glenn's face crumpled. I didn't know. I swear to God, Marseille, I didn't know any of this. You should have known. You're my husband. You should have known something was wrong. You should have cared enough to notice I was gone. She turned away from him, done with this conversation, done with watching him realize how badly he'd failed. But you didn't. So now you're going to live with that. Marseille, please, let me fix this. You can't fix being invisible, Glenn. You can't undo 3 years of choosing everything else over me. You can't bring back the woman who loved you, because she died in that well. Marseille started walking away, then paused and looked back. Oh, and you might want to call your lawyer. You're about to lose everything you think you own." She left him standing in the cemetery, calling her name, begging her to come back and explain. But Marseille was done explaining. She was done begging for scraps of attention from a man who had proven he would always choose his mother over his wife. The fourth appearance was at the Connolly estate itself. Marseille stood at the gates late at night, watching lights move through the windows of what used to be her home. She could see Glenn in his study, pacing back and forth, probably driving himself crazy, trying to figure out what was happening. She could see Diane in the sitting room, her silhouette rigid and tense. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. Ruth had filed the will with the court that afternoon. The legal machinery was now in motion. Authentication, validation, challenges from the Connolly family lawyers. It would take time, but the end result was inevitable. Edmund Connolly's will was ironclad, and Marseille had the evidence to prove she'd found the chest exactly where it had been hidden for over a century. The police investigation was underway too. Forensics had confirmed Diane's fingerprints on the boards covering the well. They'd found the cut rope ladder. They'd documented everything before Diane could destroy the evidence. Soon, all of this would be hers. The estate, the companies, the fortune that Diane had tried to protect by murdering the woman she saw as a threat. Marseille pressed her hand against the cold iron of the gate and whispered a promise to the house beyond. "I'm coming for you, all of you." Inside the mansion, she saw Glenn appear at his study window. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the darkness as if he could feel her presence. His face was tortured, lost, desperate for answers he couldn't find. Marseille felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy, but she crushed it before it could take root. Glenn had made his choices. He'd chosen his work, his mother, his comfortable ignorance over his wife. He'd let Diane poison their marriage without ever questioning her motives or methods. Now he would pay for that choice. Marseille turned and walked away from the gates, disappearing into the night. Behind her, Glenn remained at the window, staring at shadows that held no answers, haunted by the ghost of a wife he'd lost before she'd ever disappeared. Chapter 5. The Truth Emerges. The annual Connolly Foundation Gala was the social event of the season, an evening where the wealthy gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while sipping champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Diane had organized it herself, turning what had started as her husband's modest charity work into a glittering showcase of the Connolly family's superiority. Tonight, Diane stood at the podium in a silver gown, her hair perfect, her smile radiant as she addressed a ballroom full of donors. Glenn sat at the head table, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd as if searching for something he couldn't name. He was searching for her. Marseille knew this because she'd been watching them both for weeks, learning their patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tonight was that moment. Marseille walked into the ballroom, wearing a gold dress that shimmered under the chandeliers, her short hair styled sleek and sophisticated. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with the kind of confidence that made people step aside without thinking about it. She walked straight to the front of the ballroom while Diane was mid-speech, talking about family legacy and the importance of protecting what matters most. "Excuse me," Marseille said, her voice cutting through Diane's carefully rehearsed words. "I need to interrupt." The room went silent. All eyes turned to the woman in gold walking toward the stage with purpose in every step. Diane's face went white, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her pale skin. Glenn stood up so fast, his chair fell backward with a crash that echoed through the ballroom. "Marseille?" She ignored him, climbing the stairs to the stage and walking directly to the podium. Diane backed away, her hand pressed to her chest, as if checking to make sure her heart was still beating. "My name is Marseille Peake Connolly," she said into the microphone. her voice steady and clear. 1 month ago, my mother-in-law tried to murder me. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, exclamations, the sound of hundreds of people reacting at once. Security moved toward the stage, but Marseille held up one hand. "I have evidence," she said calmly. "Police evidence, legal evidence, and I have the law on my side. So I suggest everyone sit down and listen, because this is the last time the Connolly family will control anything." Glenn pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of horror and confusion. "Marseille, what are you doing?" "Telling the truth. Something your family seems allergic to." She opened the portfolio and pulled out documents, photographs, police reports. "Diane Connolly lured me to the abandoned well on the estate property under the pretense of retrieving your childhood drawings. When I climbed down, she cut the rope ladder and covered the well with boards, leaving me to die." "That's a lie!" Diane's voice cracked with panic. "She left voluntarily. She abandoned Glenn. I have text messages." "Messages you sent from my phone after you pushed me." Marseille displayed a photograph on the projection screen behind her. The well, the boards, the police evidence markers. "The police forensics team found your fingerprints on those boards, Diane. They found my bruises documented at the hospital. They found the rope ladder you cut with fibers matching the knife in your garden shed." The room's energy shifted from shock to horror. People were pulling out their phones, recording this, making sure they had proof of what was happening. Glenn made it to the stage, grabbing Marseille's arm. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me immediately?" She looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness. "I called you, Glenn, from the gas station after a stranger pulled me out. You declined the call because you were in a meeting." The words hit him like bullets. Glenn's hand dropped from her arm, his face going slack with the weight of what she was saying. "I spent 20 hours in that well," Marseille continued, speaking to the room now. 20 hours while your charity gala invitations were being sent out, while your mother was hosting luncheons and accepting awards for her humanitarian work. 20 hours while my husband went about his business, never once questioning why his wife had suddenly disappeared. "I thought you left me," Glenn whispered, but the microphone caught it anyway. "I know. Your mother made sure of that." Marseille turned back to the audience. "But here's the interesting part. While I was trapped at the bottom of that well, I found something. Something that's going to change everything." She pulled out the will, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is the last will and testament of Edmund Connolly, written over a century ago. He hid his fortune in that same well because his sons had proven themselves unworthy of inheriting it. He wrote that whoever found his chest would become the true heir to the Connolly fortune." The room's silence was absolute now. Even the people recording had frozen, their phones forgotten, as they listened to Marseille systematically dismantle everything the Connolly family represented. "I found that chest," Marseille said, "which means, according to Edmund Connolly's legally binding will, I am the rightful owner of the entire Connolly estate, not some of it, not a portion of it, all of it." Diane made a sound like a wounded animal. "You're lying. You fabricated that will. You're trying to steal what belongs to my family." "Your family tried to steal my life." Marseille's voice cut through Diane's hysteria like a blade. "And now you're going to watch me take everything you thought was yours, the estate, the companies, the foundation, the Connolly name itself. It's all mine. Legally, irrevocably, permanently mine." She displayed the will on the screen, authenticated by experts, validated by the court, irrefutable in its language and intent. The audience could see every word, every seal, every signature that proved Edmund Connolly had wanted his fortune to go to someone who had survived darkness rather than someone who had been born into privilege. Glenn stood beside Marseille, reading the will with an expression of complete devastation. "This is real," he said softly. "This is actually real." "Yes." Marseille turned to face him directly. "Your great-great-grandfather knew what your family would become. He saw his sons destroy each other over money, and he decided that blood meant nothing if it was poisoned by greed, so he hid everything and waited for someone worthy to find it. "And that's you?" Glenn's voice was barely audible. "You're the worthy one. I'm the one who survived what your mother did to me. I'm the one who was pulled out of hell by a stranger who showed more compassion in 5 minutes than your family showed in 3 years. I'm the one who earned this inheritance by refusing to die." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to something only he could hear. "I loved you, Glenn. I loved you so much that I ignored every warning sign, every red flag, every moment of neglect because I thought if I just tried harder, you'd finally see me. But you never did. You chose your mother, your work, your comfortable ignorance over and over and over again. So now you get to live with the consequences." Glenn's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. God, Marseille, I'm so sorry. Your apology is 1 month too late." She turned back to the ballroom, addressing the stunned audience. "The court has validated Edmund Connolly's will. As of this morning, I am the legal owner of all Connolly assets. Diane Connolly is being charged with attempted murder. And Glenn—" She looked at her husband one last time. "Glenn needs to find a new place to live because the estate belongs to me now." Security finally reached the stage, but they weren't there for Marseille. They were there for Diane, who had collapsed in her chair, hyperventilating and clutching at her chest, as she realized that everything she'd done to protect her son's inheritance had destroyed it instead. Marseille watched Diane being helped out of the ballroom by paramedics, watched the woman who had tried to bury her being carried away in disgrace. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only cold certainty that justice had been served. Glenn remained on stage, standing alone in his tuxedo while the ballroom erupted around him. People were leaving, talking, making calls, spreading the news that the Connolly Empire had just fallen into the hands of the woman they'd tried to kill. "Marseille," Glenn said her name like a prayer. "Please, can we talk? Can I explain?" "There's nothing to explain." She gathered her documents, preparing to leave. "You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know what she did." "But you should have. That's the whole point, Glenn. You should have known something was wrong. You should have cared enough to look for me. You should have chosen me at least once in 3 years of marriage." Marseille walked toward the stage stairs, then paused. "The lawyers will contact you about vacating the estate. You have 30 days. She left him there, standing on the stage in a ballroom full of people who had just watched his entire world collapse. Behind her, Glenn called her name one more time, his voice breaking on the syllables. But Marseille didn't turn around. She'd spent 3 years waiting for him to see her, to choose her, to love her the way she deserved to be loved. She was done waiting. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Marseille moved into the Connolly mansion on a Thursday morning, walking through the front doors she'd once entered as an unwelcome bride. The staff lined up in the foyer, uncertain and nervous, but she addressed them calmly. "Anyone who wants to stay may stay," she told them. "Anyone who doesn't is free to leave with severance and a good reference. But understand this, Diane Connolly is never welcome in this house again. Anyone who contacts her on the property's behalf will be terminated immediately." Most stayed. They'd worked for the family for years, but they'd also seen how Diane treated people she considered beneath her. Marseille represented a chance for change, and they were willing to give her that chance. Glenn's belongings were already gone by the time she arrived. He'd moved out in the middle of the night, taking only what he could carry, leaving behind the life he'd been born into. Marseille walked through the master bedroom, Diane's former domain, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Every photograph of Diane came down. Every piece of furniture the woman had chosen was removed. Every trace of her attempted murderer was systematically erased. The legal proceedings moved quickly after the gala. The will had been validated by multiple experts. The court had ruled in Marseille's favor, and the Connolly assets transferred to her ownership within weeks. Diane's lawyers tried every tactic they could think of, claiming the will was forged, claiming Marseille had coerced Glenn into marriage for money, claiming the chest had been planted, but none of it stuck. The evidence was too solid, the law too clear. Edmund Connolly had written his will with the explicit purpose of protecting his fortune from unworthy heirs. His great-great-granddaughter-in-law had proven herself worthy by surviving attempted murder. The judge had no choice but to honor the old man's final wishes. Diane's trial for attempted murder was scheduled for the following month. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Fingerprints on the boards, the cut rope ladder with fibers matching her tools, the fake text messages sent from Marseille's phone, the police documentation of everything before Diane knew her crime had failed. Her lawyers were already negotiating a plea deal, trying to get her sentenced to a psychiatric facility instead of prison. Marseille attended every hearing, sitting in the front row where Diane could see her. The older woman had aged a decade in the past few months. Her perfect composure shattered, her designer clothes replaced with prison jumpsuits. She refused to look at Marseille directly, keeping her eyes downcast, but Marseille knew Diane felt her presence like a weight. Glenn came to one of the hearings. He sat in the back row, looking like a ghost of himself, and left before the proceedings ended. Marseille saw him go but said nothing. What was there to say? He'd lost his inheritance, his mother, and his wife in the span of a few months. The empire his father had died trying to save was now owned by the woman Glenn had failed to protect. The business side of the transition was more complicated. The Connolly companies were vast and interconnected, built over generations. Marseille spent her days meeting with executives, lawyers, accountants, learning the full scope of what she now owned. It was overwhelming at first, but she discovered she had a talent for it. She asked hard questions, refused to accept vague answers, and fired anyone who treated her with the condescension that had defined her marriage. Glenn's siblings came to her one by one, begging her not to destroy the family business. Hundreds of people depended on those jobs. Thousands more were connected to the Connolly Empire's success. Would she really punish innocent workers for what Diane had done? "I'm not punishing anyone," Marseille told them. "I'm restructuring. The Connolly family built this empire through exploitation and nepotism. I'm going to rebuild it into something better." She promoted people who had been held back by the family's favoritism. She increased wages for workers who had been underpaid for years. She dissolved the vanity projects Diane had created, the charitable foundations that existed more for photo opportunities than actual charity, and redirected those funds to organizations that did real work. The community response was immediate and positive. People who had resented the Connolly family's arrogance suddenly saw Marseille as a hero, someone who had survived their cruelty and emerged powerful enough to change everything. Articles appeared in newspapers, interviews aired on local news, social media celebrated her as a symbol of justice and female empowerment. Diane's carefully crafted legacy crumbled as people learned the truth about what she'd done. The awards were rescinded, the honorary positions withdrawn, the social invitations stopped coming. She became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the poison of believing your bloodline made you superior to others. Marseille should have felt triumphant. She'd won. She'd taken everything from the woman who had tried to kill her, dismantled the empire that had treated her as disposable, become more powerful than any Connolly had ever been. But at night, alone in the master bedroom of the mansion, she felt hollow. The victory was real, but it was empty. Taking Diane's fortune didn't erase the 20 hours in the well. Owning the estate didn't undo 3 years of being invisible in her own marriage. Power didn't heal the wounds that had been carved into her soul. One evening, Marseille stood at the window of what used to be Glenn's study, looking out at the old well in the distance. Someone had filled it in now, covering the opening with concrete and dirt, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened there. But Marseille would never forget. She would carry that well with her forever, a darkness that lived inside her chest, where her heart used to be. A knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. One of the staff stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, Mr. Connolly is at the gate. He's asking to speak with you." Marseille's first instinct was to refuse. Glenn had lost the right to enter this house when he'd failed to protect her from his mother, but curiosity won out. What could he possibly want to say that would matter now? "Let him in," she said. "Bring him to the sitting room." She met him there, standing while he sat, maintaining the power dynamic that had reversed so completely. Glenn looked terrible, gaunt, exhausted, his expensive suit hanging off him like it belonged to someone else. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. "You have 5 minutes." Glenn flinched at her coldness, but he'd earned it. "I'm not here to beg for the house back or ask for money. I know I have no right to ask you for anything." He paused, gathering courage for whatever he'd come to say. "I'm here to tell you that I've spent every day since the gala trying to understand how I became the kind of man who could lose his wife without even noticing. And I think I finally figured it out. I'm not interested in your self-discovery, Glenn. Please, just let me say this." He looked up at her with eyes that held genuine pain. "My father died and left me an empire I never wanted. I was drowning in responsibilities I hadn't prepared for, trying to be something I wasn't built to be. And instead of asking you for help, instead of letting you be my partner, I let my mother take over because it was easier than fighting her." "You let her take over my marriage," Marseille corrected. "You let her poison everything between us because you were too weak to stand up to her." "Yes, you're right. I was weak." Glenn's hand shook as he clasped them together. "My mother spent my whole life telling me that I had to be strong, had to be perfect, had to uphold the family legacy. And when my father died, she convinced me that you were the problem, that you distracted me, that you didn't understand what was at stake, that you were going to drag me down. So you believed her instead of trusting me. I believed her because it was easier than admitting I was failing on my own." Glenn stood up, not approaching but needing to say this on his feet. "I know this doesn't fix anything. I know my apology means nothing after what I let happen to you. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see how completely I failed you. I see that you were never the problem. I was. My mother was. This family was." Marseille felt something crack in her chest, but she refused to let it show. "If you're waiting for me to forgive you, you're going to be waiting a long time. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to believe that I loved you. Maybe not well enough, maybe not strongly enough, but I did love you. And losing you has destroyed me in ways that losing this house and the fortune never could. Then you should have fought for me when it mattered." Marseille moved toward the door, done with this conversation. "You have 30 seconds left." Glenn followed her, desperation making him brave. "What can I do? Tell me what I can do to prove I'm different now, that I've learned, that I—" "Nothing. There's nothing you can do, Glenn, because the woman you loved is dead. She died in that well when you declined her call." Marseille opened the door, gesturing for him to leave. "The woman standing here now doesn't need your love or your apologies. She just needs you gone." Glenn walked to the door, then paused at the threshold. "I'm going to prove to you that I've changed. I don't know how long it'll take, but I'm going to find a way to show you that I can be the man I should have been from the beginning. Don't bother." Marseille's voice was ice. "I'm not interested in the man you might become. I'm only interested in surviving the damage the man you were inflicted on me." She closed the door in his face and stood there listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Through the window she watched him walk across the grounds toward the gate, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Marseille turned away from the window and walked through the mansion that was now hers. Every room was filled with furniture she'd chosen, artwork she'd selected, evidence that she had erased the Connolly family and replaced it with something entirely her own. She'd won, so why did victory feel so much like loneliness? Chapter 7. The Breaking. Glenn's letters started arriving the next day. They came to the mansion's mailbox, delivered by regular post, addressed to Marseille in handwriting she recognized from the love letters he'd written when they were dating. She almost threw the first one away unopened, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside was a single page, dated at the top, written in Glenn's careful script. "I'm not asking you to read these. I'm not asking for a response. I just need you to know that I'm accounting for every moment I failed you. This is for me, not you, my attempt to understand how badly I hurt someone I claim to love. September 12th. You asked me to have dinner with you instead of working late. You'd made my favorite meal. I said I was too busy. I'm sorry. That was all. No excuses, no justifications, just the acknowledgement of one specific failure." The next day, another letter arrived. October 3rd. My mother criticized your dress at the charity gala. You looked at me, waiting for me to defend you. I said nothing. I'm sorry. The letters continued, one per day, each documenting a specific moment when Glenn had chosen something else over Marseille. Some were small, a cancelled dinner, a dismissed concern, a moment when he'd scrolled through his phone instead of listening to her talk. Others were devastating. The day he'd agreed with his mother that Marseille was too sensitive, the time he'd forgotten their anniversary because of a business trip, the morning of the well when he'd waved her away without asking where she was going. Marseille read every single one alone in the master bedroom, crying until she was empty. Not because the letters changed anything, they didn't, but because they were proof that Glenn finally saw her, finally understood the 1,000 tiny deaths she'd endured in their marriage, the slow erosion of her self-worth as she tried and failed to matter to him. But understanding didn't undo damage. Acknowledgement didn't heal wounds. Glenn was documenting his failures as if confession might absolve him, but Marseille knew better. Some things couldn't be forgiven just because someone finally admitted they were wrong. Still, she kept the letters, stored them in a box in her closet, evidence of what she'd survived and who she'd become in the aftermath. Word spread through their social circle that Glenn had lost everything. People who had once courted his favor now avoided him, not wanting to be associated with the man whose mother had tried to murder his wife. His business connections dried up. Nobody wanted to partner with someone connected to attempted murder and a stolen inheritance. Glenn found work at a mid-level company, doing the kind of administrative tasks he'd once assigned to junior employees. He lived in a small apartment across town, drove an old car, wore clothes from department stores instead of custom tailors. Everything that had defined him, his wealth, his status, his family legacy, was gone. Marseille heard about his circumstances through the staff, who still had connections to people who had known the family. Part of her expected to feel satisfaction at Glenn's downfall, but mostly she just felt tired. Revenge was exhausting, victory was lonely, power without purpose was just an elaborate cage. One afternoon, Marseille drove past Glenn's apartment building. She didn't plan to, it just happened, her route taking her through that neighborhood. She saw him sitting on the steps outside, looking at something in his hands. She almost kept driving, almost ignored him the way he'd ignored her for 3 years. But something made her pull over, made her walk across the street to where he sat. Glenn looked up when her shadow fell across him, and she saw what he was holding, their wedding photo. The one where they were both laughing, young and hopeful and genuinely happy. Before the empire fell on his shoulders, before Diane poisoned everything, before the well. "I found this when I was packing," Glenn said quietly. "I'd forgotten what we looked like when we were happy." Marseille sat on the steps beside him, maintaining distance but present. "That feels like it happened to different people." "It did. I was someone else then. Someone better." He turned the photo over, and Marseille saw that he'd written something on the back. "The day I promised to love you forever. I'm sorry I didn't keep that promise." They sat in silence for a while, two broken people sharing space without expectation. "I visited my mother," Glenn said eventually, "in the facility where she's waiting for trial." Marseille stiffened. "How is she?" "Destroyed. She keeps saying she was trying to protect me, that everything she did was because she loved me too much." He shook his head. "I told her that her love was poison, that she'd ruined my life by convincing me I needed protecting from the woman who actually made me happy." "What did she say?" "Nothing. She just cried, and for the first time in my life, I didn't try to comfort her. I just left." Glenn handed the photo to Marseille. "I'm not showing you this to make you forgive me. I'm showing you because you deserve to know that I finally understand what I destroyed. You gave me everything, your love, your patience, your forgiveness for things I never should have been forgiven for. And I threw it away because I was too weak to stand up to a woman who couldn't accept that someone else made me happy." Marseille looked at the photo, at their younger selves who had no idea what was coming. "You asked me once what you could do to prove you'd changed. Here's the answer: nothing. There's nothing you can do, Glenn, because even if you became perfect tomorrow, it wouldn't change what you were when I needed you. I know. And I can't trust you. I can't trust anyone. Your mother taught me that the people who claim to love you are the ones most likely to hurt you. I know that too." Glenn stood up, brushing dust off his cheap pants. "I'm not going to stop sending the letters. I need to finish accounting for every failure, every moment I chose wrong. Not because I think it'll change your mind, but because I need to understand the full scope of what I destroyed." Marseille handed the photo back to him. "Keep it. I don't need reminders of who I used to be." She walked back to her car, feeling Glenn's eyes on her the whole way. When she looked in the rearview mirror, he was still standing on the steps, holding that wedding photo like it was the only valuable thing he had left. The letters continued, dozens of them, then hundreds, each documenting another specific failure. Marseille read them all, letting Glenn's confession wash over her like cold water. She didn't respond, didn't acknowledge them, just let them accumulate in the box in her closet. But she noticed something changing in the letters as weeks passed. Glenn wasn't just cataloging failures anymore. He was beginning to understand why he'd made those choices, what fears and insecurities had driven him to choose his mother over his wife, work over love, convenience over courage. The letters became more insightful, more painful, more honest. Glenn was doing the work of actually changing, not just performing change in hopes of a reward. He was becoming the man he should have been, even though it was too late to matter. And Marseille, alone in her mansion, powerful and wealthy and completely isolated, began to wonder if revenge was all she wanted, if winning was worth the emptiness that came with it, if she'd survived the well only to trap herself in a different kind of darkness. She had everything: the estate, the fortune, the power to destroy anyone who crossed her. But late at night, reading Glenn's letters by lamplight, she had nothing at all. Chapter 8. The Impossible Choice. The discovery came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while Marseille was organizing the study's old filing cabinets. She'd been putting it off for months. Sorting through decades of Connolly family documents felt like archaeology, digging through the remnants of people who had believed their blood made them special. But the lawyers needed certain papers for the final transfer of assets, so Marseille forced herself to go through every drawer, every box, every forgotten file that might hold something important. That was how she found the second letter. It was tucked in the back of the